Hello, everyone. We are really thrilled to see you all. And please give another very, very warm welcome to Theaster Gates and David Adjaye. We are so incredibly grateful to Theaster for creating this amazing, amazing pavilion. It is really a dream come true, and also deeply grateful to David, who for so many years gives amazing support as advisor to our pavilions. And I wanted to also actually remember here our late friend Richard Rogers, who has been incredibly important in dialogue with David and us in terms of the pavilion scheme. Richard always said, I promise to leave this city better than I entered it. But he also said, and I took this note once in one of our many meetings here at the office, I strongly feel there is more to architecture than architecture. It's about social responsibility and transformation. And I think there couldn't be a better quote, really, to describe the amazing work of Theaster. It's great that we can have this conversation today in the pavilion. It's actually the first program we are doing. It will be followed by many performances conceived as part of the project, also the park nights. And we're so delighted that actually Theaster agreed to be involved with this. And the amazing paintings which are here are also, in a way, a scar for all the things that Theaster told us, which are going to happen here, many sonic things. So we hope that you can come back many, many times over this summer. Actually, the Serpentine Pavilion, the Black Chapel 2022, is part of the Question of Clay, and that is a multi-institution project. It was this amazing idea of Theaster to actually get institutions to collaborate, something which should happen much, much more often. Exhibitions at the Whitechapel, Y-Cube, and also a 2-year-long research at the V&A in London are part of this project. We're going to talk today about the pavilion and the wider program. And I want to say just before we begin that the pavilion would not be possible to be realized without the many supporters who help us. There are too many to mention, but I want to thank here the key supporters who made this pavilion possible. The headline partner, Goldman Sachs, who are actually supporting the pavilion for the 8th consecutive year. The supporting partners, the Luma Foundation, and also the Therme Group. Our responsible materials advisor, Design for Freedom by Grace Farms. We'd also like to thank our technical advisors, ACOM, whose expertise is fundamental really every year to realize this commission. And thanks, many thanks, go also to Stage 1 Creative Services, who work closely with the architect and the Serpentine to construct the pavilion every year. I'd also like to thank the galleries, Gagosian, Regan Project, and Whitecube for their support. And as always, all our thanks, of course, goes to the advisors to the commission, as mentioned before, to David, who is here with us, and also to David Glover, to whom we are all very, very grateful. And I'm always worried when we do talks in the pavilion that the notes are going to fly away. We once had a talk with amazing philosopher Zygmunt Bauman, and both his script and my script were gone. Now, Theaster Studio have been integral to the success of this project. I'd like to thank everyone at the studio, in particular Sabina Boccari and Emma German. A big round of applause!
Hey! Very nice. It's so nice.
And last but not least, very importantly, I want to thank the Serpentine Dream Team, our CEO, Bettina Korek, Julie Brunel, Director of Construction and Special Project, who has overseen 20 pavilions to date, the curatorial vision of Yezomi Omulu, Natalia Grabowska, Chris Bailey, and the curators of live program, Bianca Mano and Uma Kawadara. A very big round of applause. And I have prepared a few questions, but we hope that this talk will be very open, and there will also be many conversations, of course, between David and Theaster, and we'll also take questions from or comments from all of you. And Theaster, you told me in a previous interview that it was around 2008. It was also a moment of a market crash. You started to have this practice which has a lot to do with social sculpture in a way. You started to really transform neighborhoods. You started to take over buildings. It's the beginning of the Rebuild Foundation. And when we visited you, and that was really the beginning of this pavilion, is when we visited your studio and realized the incredible transformation on so many different levels. There was a laboratory, there was your studio. We saw housing, we saw your housing projects. Can you tell us a little bit, because it would be interesting, I think, in terms of what David just said, how you then made this transition?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll say that, you know, I'm saying these things to us as a way of understanding my kind of artistic arc, because I think sometimes it's easy to just like say pithy things, but I'm actually trying to. So I was asked the question yesterday, like, well, you know, it seemed like you started as a conceptual artist, and then you ended up as a maker. And so I tried to kind of help bridge the arc. And what I had to say was that, no, I was always making and talking, but the talking caught on faster, and no one was interested in my pots. So I would make them, and then I'd give them away, and people were like happy that I'd show up to a barbecue because I would have like a salad bowl, like a sake cup, you know what I mean? I'd be like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't afford to give you anything but this pot. And they were like, great, and it was a little heavy, it was a little too heavy. I really like heavy pots, they were very heavy. But it started out making and talking, and then it went from talking to actioning, but the making was always happening. But publicly, it went from talking to actioning, and then it was like a TED Talk in there. And then it was like, oh, this guy talks at TED. And then Rebuild was born, and it was like maybe in the city or in New York, or these journalists, they were more interested in practices that were dealing with the destitute and the woe and the change in the world, and right? And it's like that stuff was useful as a come up, but it's also a very quick way to be exposed, because like at some point, they're gonna be like, look, I thought he was doing it for these reasons, and he's actually a gentrifying crook. And so there was this, you know, but all along I'm making. Now, what's also interesting is that in Chicago, I was talking and actioning, but in Berlin and London and China, I was selling objects. I was making things that were living out in the world. I was having exhibitions at Kunsthaus Bregenz, you know, and so, right? And that was happening, and so there was this thing that appeared to be a minor miracle, which was I had excess resource, money, people from other parts of the world who wanted to come to Chicago. I had excess resource that could then feed the machine that was happening in Chicago, thereby making the thing seem like a miracle. Like he's talking and actioning, and then he just finished 10 buildings. And it's like, no. It was actually the Chicago Transit Authority, when I learned how to manage a budget, when I learned how to project manage, when I understood what it means to like try to empower team members. And, you know, and we wonkied through that stuff. It wasn't perfect. But Rebuild seemed the right kind of receptacle that could help advance the programmatic side of the building. So I was like, you can't just have a building. You gotta have a program, right? So we would finish the building, and then it's like, well, I can't afford to finish the building and pay for a team. I need a public charity that can help me, right? But all this time, I think the art was getting better. And then the art was like failing in public. I was trying things on. I was making, shoe shine stands and, things that felt important at the time. But figuring out a vocabulary, Hans, of like, I want to honor local labor. I want to feel like whatever my local history was, that it's as important as Robert Irwin's history. It's as important as Gerhard Richter's history. It's as important as the sisters. I'm always thinking about Eva Hesse. Like, what does it mean to like leave your country, go to another country, have an aha moment in Germany, like at a post-industrial time, and then find your practice change. That happened to me in Japan. And so it was like, man, I wanted to be moved in public. It's like, oh, he must have just got back from Japan. It's like, yeah, I just got back from Japan, yeah. My T-bowls are better. You know, and so I think that in that sense, the arc was always, I was doing more than the world knew, and not all of it was good. And then over time, if you stay with the arc long enough, Lionheart, over time, the parts start to come together, I guess is what I'm saying. And then it seems more seamless and singular, but in fact, it starts out compartmental and messy.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. I think that a lot of people, there's an incredible amount of bravery that's, I love this breezeway.
It's really good. It's gonna be great when it's super hot in summer.
Now, actually, thank you so much.
Engineering.
Now, I always remember we always have these meetings, no, with our advisors, with David, and it was 4 or 5 years ago, and we were discussing with David and Richard Rogers, and Richard talked about the quote I was mentioning about responsibility, and then David, you said we've got to consider with the pavilions that architecture is a social act. Yeah. And it just came back to my mind, that quote, when Theaster was speaking. So it would be great if you could talk a little bit about that, about your kind of vision of architecture as a social act, because I think it connects you both so deeply, no?
I'm just loving the way you poured that. I think that trajectory that Theaster just described is very analogous to the discovery of why I wanted to do architecture and what I was interested in architecture for. Because for me, it's really hard when you come from you grow up in a community where you're a minority to find a reason to be part of the majority or an idea in the majority. And so I think that one needs to really work through what it is that you actually feel comfortable with and what you want to say about yourself in the world. And so for me, when I was studying architecture, it made no sense until I had a lecture where, I heard everything but what the building was. I heard, it was really actually listening to Hassan Fatih, talking about ideas, hearing about what Louis Kahn was talking about, and suddenly realizing that, oh my God, it wasn't about all the stuff that was sort of, my education and my background had excluded me from, but it was really about all the things that actually you experienced and were deeply sort of formed by. And so for me, that is when my imagination of architecture sparked. And, my first, I was kind of an okay architect until my sort of final year. And when I discovered, it suddenly dawned on me what this issue was. And I decided to make a project about my little brother. And it was about disability in public space. So the invisible and the visible. And I did this project and it was completely introverted. I made the brief up. Nobody had even seen the brief before at that time. And then I won this national award. And everybody was like, what the hell, where did this come from? And that's for me, the genesis of the whole thing. And then I realized, oh my God, this thing is about, seeing yourself in the world and having the confidence to actually make things in the world that actually also talk about you. Because what you are in the world also is about a shared community of experiences, which are all about how we all kind of move in the space. So for me, this idea of a kind of architecture being more than just the sum of construction, more than just the performance in the program, but being something that also connects and kind of reinforces ideas and identities and became profoundly important and became deeply inspirational. In fact, it actually became the fuel that actually made me want to bother, because in a way, I was like, and sorry, I'm waffling, but like,
it's great.
it's just the idea that somehow there is so much building in the world. There is so much building in the world already. But the idea that actually there isn't enough real buildings in the world became really clear.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful.
No, Hans, this point that in a way architecture could start with something deeply personal, and that from the most intimate and maybe the most vulnerable place one might make, I think that's the only way that I could actually enter this. That if it wasn't for the possibility of like honoring others or paying homage to a thing or acknowledging the truth of histories that mean a lot to me, those are the things that kind of they're the fuel that drive my imagination and my creativity. And without these histories and these personal stories, I can't start with the square. The square isn't enough for me to say, I'm just gonna lean into the square. I'm not from that. It's not to say that the square isn't a useful tool or that one couldn't start from any point in any set of kind of philosophical spaces. But it's just to say that for me, I wouldn't make a chapel if I didn't like chapels. I wouldn't just make a chapel because every person before they die should make a chapel. That in a way, at the moment that I thought about the sacred possibilities within architecture, and that what could I offer to the field, given that I'm not an architect, that I don't have certifications, that I'm not trained in the engineering strategies and the translation work necessary between architects and engineers and clients. I don't have that language. What I have is, I know how I like being immersed in space. I know how to extend verticality so that verticality denotes the holy. Louise Nevelson taught me that if you if you paint it all one color, then you're left with form, and you don't have to be preoccupied with the histories of those varying forms. But when you cradle those things together, this building reflects a kind of sincerity that, like, I understand post and beam. I understand bloom framing because I put those buildings up and took them. I dissected them like a transistor radio, lathe by lathe, plaster, tons of plaster, removing it and trying to understand, like, what did these sisters and brothers 100 years ago have behind these walls? And you would find interesting things behind them walls. Or you would find the fact that those builders also longed to be remembered 100 years from the time that they made the building, knowing that at some point, someday, somebody might see their initials carved into a 2x4. It's that idea that we all long for meaning and purposefulness, and that the best place I can start with the built environment is at home.
Can I add that it's really that inspiration of looking at the absolute, what I'll call superordinary, was just so invaluable to have you kind of guide the selection of everything in this environment. There are ways in which architects can work whereby there are certain things that become fetishized as aesthetic, even in architecture, in everything, right? And there are systems that become fetishized as the things that will be used, the columns that we prefer, the beams we prefer, the claddings that we prefer. And what was really amazing with the dialogue with you and your team was just the kind of absolute reduction and sort of mistrust of the kind of that coding in order to make something new. And so I think that there was something, you know, Duncan and my team, who was really working very closely with your team, would always come back and we'd be like, wow, yeah, no, let's go more into that. Yeah. Let's find those things that Theaster wants. Because also, in a weird way, for you, I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, but this was not about salvaging, even though we did try to think of that. We tried, but we were like, oh, where can we go salvage what? You know. But so then this had to be about what is in that ordinary that we could use. And with, you know, with what we know about wanting to be light, wanting to make absolute zero carbon footprint, wanting to kind of do all these things that are right, but actually not have that be the kind of first thing, work with you and understand exactly how you wanted to see the body of this thing was really, really powerful.
David, I'd like to, Hans, if it's okay, I'd like to give you all, we haven't talked about this, but to just give you an example of the process. We're getting down to the wire, and I got to make some drawings. So I make a circle, and not in the center of the circle, but on one side of the circle, I have two lines. I wanted to bifurcate what I call the outer sanctuary from the inner sanctuary. And I'm doing that through two tall walls that would create a total procession space through the oculus, through the sphere, right? And I wanted the walls to go up to the top of the full dome, and that you would be able to cut through that, okay? And then, as you see, there would have been doors, let's say doors as they are there, openings, and then on the inner sanctuary, the inner sanctuary, you would have doors inside, outside and inside, or parallel. We had to do some value engineering. So David and David's team then was like, well, we got to get rid of one of the walls. And I was like, no, but if all I got left is the procession space, and the monks need to go, and we need this. Hans like that shit when I start singing. We need to be able to do that. And I felt really strongly that so many things had been stripped by necessity, then we had to then make that necessity feel right, stripped and stripped and stripped. And then every once in a while I would get a call from David, and I'm like, fuck. Because it's like, David's call is usually like, he gonna say the same thing that the other people had to say, and then I just can't argue about it anymore, essentially. So David said, T, I think if we lose one wall, we'll save about 75,000 pounds or something. And I don't think you'll lose that much by having the one wall. And this is where it's a little friendship, it's a little
trust, yeah.
Trust, architectural knowing, meeting, you know what I mean? And then I tried to then draw it with one wall. And I realized that what I would get is a wall that functions more as a kind of backdrop or foreground to the rest of the building. And then because the sphere also had to shrink a little bit, it would also give us another, 10 feet, 12 feet that would allow for more of us to be in the room, right? And so these kinds of things were happening at a clip of every 2 days, every 3 days, because we only had 2 weeks total once we were in that moment to like value engineer. And it was extremely
baptism of fire.
Emotional. It's one thing to say that I'm the whatever, that without that friendship and that expertise and that history of making architectural forms, David wouldn't have been able to arrive so quickly at settling me. But because of friendship and trust and his deep knowledge of architectural form, if he said, look, bro, we're gonna keep the one wall, we're gonna fight to keep that, we're gonna keep the oculus, we figured out the structural post, that then we could go back to work, right? And in this case, the value engineering that needed to happen, it started to have its own sets of poetics that were seductive and attractive and more honest than I maybe would have been, because I was trying to design something more architectural.
Yep.
You know, and so I think what we ended up with was a kind of a sincerity of form.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, I mean, what you just, there is a kind of magic in the making of buildings where there is this moment where you've got to sort of, there's a kind of, it is really a baptism of fire. It's a kind of rinsing out of all the excesses. Because at a certain point, which you can't face at the beginning because you're just trying to create form, there has to be a moment where you realize that there is the infinite resources of the planet and the resources of an institution, and how do we bring that all into becoming a synthesis that has its absolute perfection. And I think that, what I've learned is that actually in that sort of baptism, or in that sort of fire, if the three parts of the equation, the constructor, the institution, the makers, are all kind of aligned with understanding the vision, you can refine and refine and refine to a point where a certain specifics, I would say specifics, appears from the need of the project that becomes the poetry of the project. And it's actually like a really magical moment that is like, it's one of the drugs that I'm addicted to in architecture. Because it becomes this thing where it almost has its own, it becomes like an organism. And then you stand, and what you just have to do is to follow the orders it's giving you, right? It clarifies what it needs to do. And it's no longer about following what you want it to do, but what it needs to do. And it always happens in architecture. And it's really hard to describe it because a lot of architects don't talk about it, but it actually happens in every single project that I've been working on for the last 30 years. And it is just this profound thing. But then, details start to appear that were not in the beginning. Forms and shapes start to appear, light forms in different ways. It's just so beautiful. And I think that the what I call the kind of burning of the chaff in a way, in this project really kind of revealed a very kind of noble, beautiful body. Yeah.
But it's actually fascinating, the idea of an organism, and because the other day I was rereading kind of Schwitters, and Kurt Schwitters talked about the Märzbau, and listening to you both, I was just thinking, about the definition kind of, or the description Schwitters gave when he called this organism of the Märzbau a shrine of friendship. So I feel, listening to you both, that we are here in a shrine of friendship. But I wanted to go one step further back to the beginnings of the process, because you've described both in such an incredible way the process and the dialogue. Because I remember when we were in Chicago and we looked at some of your clay works, that you talked about them kind of, sort of being micro, but potentially also macro. And you reiterated that yesterday, the day before yesterday, when you suggested, because we were recording the interview for the catalog, and you had this great idea that we should do it going on a walk. So we had a conversation, amazing conversation in the park, and at a certain moment, we started to talk about Calder, about Alexander Calder. And I did this exhibition some years ago about Calder's unrealized projects. When he would have all these little maquettes, microscopic maquettes, but he imagined them to be gigantic. And all of a sudden, I realized that maybe all of your small clay works are maquettes for bigger buildings. So there might be many more buildings in the future, we hope. So I wanted to ask you to talk about that a little bit, because you made initially, I remember, when we invited you, you made this series of small pavilions out of clay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you just said, that when I first learned of clay, its project inside me was one-to-one. It's like I was told to make 20 cups. I made 20 cups, and all I was thinking about was the 20 cups. 3 or 4 years go on, and I'm told to make 20 cups. And then I'm now thinking about things that are inside me and I have this responsibility to make 20 cups, and now the cups are reflecting the things that are inside me. They have gashes and gnashes, and they're mutating. They look like they have hips and necks, and they go from generic cups to cups that have something of me in it. A few more years, I start spending time in Japan. I'm told to make 20 cups. And then my Japanese instructor says, why are you trying to make Japanese tea bowls when there are great ceramic traditions in Mississippi? Why don't you try making a Mississippi bowl? So I gotta go to Japan, where I think I'm learning to make a Japanese pot, to have a Japanese pot to tell me, why are you trying to make a Japanese pot, nigga? You need to be looking at your own shit, right? And I really had to go to Japan to think about Mississippi, and I had to see a Japanese fish shack to remember that we had broke down fish shacks in Mississippi that were equally elegant. But in a way, because I had othered Japan, my eyes were open to Japan in a different way. And so after that checking by my sensei, I come back to the 20 bowls, 20 cups, and then all of a sudden they have even more me imbued, let's say. And now I feel I can look at a cup and I can imagine it as a philosophical intent, a religious intent, an extension of a yogic practice, or I could imagine the cup as being 2 inches or 2 meters or 200 meters. And it took me 25 years to get from a cup is a cup to a form is a form, let's say.
Oh, sorry, I just thought I'd mirror it because there's lots of twinnings going on here, but my obsession with the continent started also when I went to Japan. That I needed to go to Kyoto and spend, nearly 2 years looking at Kyoto shrines to realize that there were so many beautiful shrines in Africa that were being destroyed and nobody looked at anymore. And I suddenly realized how much, it's amazing how you have to go so far to kind of to come straight back to your own heart. Yeah.
That's actually incredible that you mentioned it, because we sat exactly at that same very spot in 2006. And we did the interview marathon with Rem Koolhaas. It was a 24-hour non-stop interview about London. And it all began with David, because you couldn't actually stay for the marathon because you had to go, because you were in the middle of that research.
Photographing every city on the continent.
Yeah. And so that began in Japan.
Yeah. I wanted to re-see the continent.
Amazing. And when we think about the beginnings of this pavilion, there is, of course, also early in the conversation, you said that Black Chapel was a direct evolution of your first outdoor permanent commission, the Black Vessel for a Saint in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And at the same time, you also mentioned our friend Okwi, David's friend, your friend, my friend Okwi, whom we have to remember here, and the amazing work you did in Munich, which has also is a predecessor. That's kind of interesting in terms of the genesis of this space, to maybe hear a bit more about what you did in Minneapolis, and then, how really the Black Chapel also began in Munich.
Yeah, when I over the years, as I started to read artist biographies and just kind of read about the works that they would make, or for a while I was looking at Rauschenberg a lot, who was also looking at the Black South a lot. I was just kind of and how works would migrate from one work to another, and works would kind of like he has a ram with horns, and this ram would kind of move from work to work. And when you didn't have the burden of selling everything that you make, you could allow works to morph and migrate. And so you're just like, oh, I used it for that museum show, I'm gonna take it out of that thing and I'm gonna put it in this other thing. And so I became really excited that I could have a conversation between exhibitions, or a conversation with myself across a series of exhibitions, kind of threading them, and that some things would be recurrences, right? And so in this case, Black Chapel, the title of this, is the second iteration of Black Chapel, and is cousin to Black Vessel, which is an exhibition I did at Gagosian during COVID. And I think that the intention was there was still meat on them bones at Haus der Kunst. And I wasn't able to get at all the things that I wanted to say in that space because that space already had so much heavy history on it. I was just trying to pray my way out of that space. I was trying to, I was dealing with Hitler. I was grappling with what can I offer, and so I offered Jesse Owens as a kind of a runner and a winner, a black winner in Germany, who the Germans loved. Like, it was like, we gonna beat your ass on the court, on the track, and we gonna make you love us, you know what I'm saying? And the way that I was able to bring his victory into the room was by bringing his corpse, which was essentially this album collection, because once Jesse Owens stopped running, he became a DJ. So I brought kind of corpus, in a way, if you will, brought it, and we would just play Jesse's albums as a way of kind of converting that space into one of, let's say, black victory, or minoritized victory, or like winners with love, you know what I mean? And so I know that for some architectural critics, the value of the pavilion has to do with one's algorithmic proclivities, or their ability to wield materials in ways that are profoundly unknowable because there's deep understanding in the super systems of their computers or something. But that's not what I was after. I was after a sacred zone where one might first define sacred for themselves and then use this chapel to do whatever they need to do to fight the craziness just outside the chapel, right? And so I think that in that sense, the possibility of, it's like, you don't stop using a title until the work no longer needs it. And I think I need to build a few more chapels that are black.
I want to add to that. I just think what you've just said is so profound. I think that actually with the sort of loss of confidence of religion in society publicly, I mean, it's symbolic, and some people are deeply religious, some people are not, but it's definitely not as it was in the 19th century, let's say. That actually what's interesting is that our cities are designed embedded with the notion of the sacred space. And in the 20th century, and definitely in the 21st century, something massive has happened, which is that within the topology of all the things that allows us to have the density of the city as an idea, one of the kind of most powerful spaces that was helping cathartic, respite from labor, from stress, from all the things, was the sacred space. So there was the landscape and the sacred space. And I think that in the 21st century, we've now subverted the sacred space because we've lost it and walked away from it. Most people don't even go into churches anymore. And taken the landscape as a kind of new space. But the landscape is one thing, but the sacred space is part of our DNA of ritual space use. It really, really is. I mean, it's amazing how people think that we're somehow just wired and we can do whatever we want. We've made this thing called the city. It's taken 10,000 years to construct this idea called the city that our generation just use as though it's a phone. Walk around it. But that's 10,000 years, guys. So we're not going to go past this very quickly, FYI. We're not going to suddenly just sit in spaceships and be happy. Not for a long while. So we are evolving and we are shifting this thing, but we have created within our DNA of what our experience is, these categories of space. So if we eject it, we have to remake a new version of it. We have to remake what it is, because that's now what we are. You don't get rid of it. We've sort of evolved to become it. And I really now believe that deeply. So for me, I remember when you said you wanted to make the Black Chapel, I was like, oh my God, that's like, I remember when we were discussing it, I was like, that's the perfect project. Because actually, it is without it's without religion, but it is a sacred space. And it's exactly what the city needs, right? The city needs spaces where you can just go sit silently and not feel like you have to be a Catholic or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever.
That brings us to your cathedral, David, and maybe it would be great to hear about that because, of course, talking about the sacred space, you're building a cathedral in Accra and involve actually artists in that. Can you tell us about that sacred space?
That okay. That a lot of people are like, why the hell are you doing a religious building? And I've never had my whole career, but actually secretly I've always begged to do a religious building. Those who've known my sort of career from day one, because anyway, I took on the project because it is for a kind of a post-colonial nation that is thinking about the idea of nationhood and understanding that that actually the sacred is profoundly part of the makeup of the space and the identity of a group of people. And that what's kind of interesting is that without that instituting, if I can say that, of that idea within the notion of the city, you get this disaggregation and this free-for-all that happens within any civilization of anybody saying what the hell they want and everything mushrooming into a kind of polyphony of, I just think, like ever and ever misunderstandings. Yeah. So the project is really more than just making a cathedral, because that's really a kind of Western word, but it's really to make a house for basically the other side of the society. And so it is, yes, it has a kind of prayer hall and a sacred space, but it has everything else. It's also a gathering space, it's also a community space, it's also a teaching space. And then it became really obvious that there is this incredible explosion of West African and diaspora artists. So, to date we have about 35 artists commissioned to work on every part of this building.
Kwame did windows.
Kwame, who we are just so grateful for, before he passed, designed the baptistry windows and 2 small chapels. So it's turned into this whole cathartic, also dialogue with the artists outside of the continent and inside the continent about this notion of what that kind of space can be.
So we need sacred space and healing space. And to come back to the pavilion, you mentioned the Black Chapel and the connection to Black Vessel. And when I read an interview you gave about the Black Vessel show, Theaster, you said that it's really about the celebration also of gathering, of being together. And I mean, now, of course, after the last 2 years, more than ever, being together is important. So also the necessity in cities, which the pavilion, I think, of the Serpentine is always about. It's about being together. And you said in an interview, how does one create social situations, gatherings, without being preoccupied by the creation of social situations? So I just wanted to ask you, as we are here all gathered in the pavilion, to maybe talk a little bit about that and about camaraderie and friendship. And of course, there are going to be many gatherings, like today's gathering we organize, but there are going to be also lots of self-organized gatherings, which we cannot plan and will never plan. And at the same time, you actually decided a few weeks ago that you would do these amazing paintings here. You created them in London in the last couple of days. You told us that they're like a score in a way, like almost like a musical score for what's going to happen. So that's of course the self-organized gathering, but there are also the planned gatherings where you're very involved with music, with sound. It will actually culminate in October when the Black Monks will come here. Yeah, it would be great to hear a little bit more about planned gatherings, self-organized gatherings, camaraderie, friendship in the pavilion.
Wow. I remember 8 or 9 years ago, I was in an institutional meeting, and a person said, I'd love, Theaster, I'd love if you could create a multi-generational, multi-racial, multi-intelligences, a place where knowledge could be shared and things could, random things could happen and people could get together and there could be reconciliation racially and healing And the guy said, do you think anything like that exists? And I said, yeah, it sounds like a cafe. So I built a cafe, I built a cafe, and I think sometimes, how do you make a space that doesn't have to be preoccupied with itself? It should do something. So you got to make a space that does something. And then the byproduct of a space, like a library. Like, a library doesn't have to worry about what else it is. If it's a good library, people might come and other things might happen, So I think there's a part of me that feels like some of this is just not that difficult. And you could throw in some German philosophy, you could throw in some French philosophy, or you don't have to. You can just kind of build a good cafe and make sure the toasties are good and the espresso is pretty good, Keep it easy. And then all of the conciliations might happen. And if you had not only a barista, but also somebody that was like concerned with the music program, then you might find that the music program is doing this other thing. And then it's like, oh, people who like that music on Tuesdays, those people come every Tuesday. And then by being a DJ, you don't have to be worried about being an organizer. You can just be a good DJ, and then people will self-organize. And I think, now I didn't want to look at the cafe part of this thing, which is why it's over there in the outer sanctuary. But I do understand the importance of having, because the cup of coffee helps people linger longer. Great potters would say, it didn't take me an hour to make that pot, it took me 50 years. Those paintings didn't happen in no days. Man, what you talking about? That's my daddy was at it for 40 years. But it's like the distillation of the roof. The distillation of the roof, right? And it's like, I don't really care what others think about those. When I first started making these paintings, I wouldn't call them paintings. I would call them roofings. Then a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, said, you don't call them paintings because you're not confident that they're good. I said, well, I want to make a good roof. And I want to imagine that the skills that I have as a roofer are comparable to the skills that a painter has. And if I could get good at making roofs, I want roofing to compete with painting, and I want painters to be jealous of my roofings. I don't know. And so, so these are no longer, they're not just homages. They paintings now. They're not just about me and my daddy. They paintings now. At some point, I hope we can let go of the biographical stuff, and then they can just live. But what I love about them is that my dad said, in order for a roof to be a good roof, it can't leak. So your painting shouldn't leak. So when I ask myself, well, what's the condition of a good roofing painting? Well, you should be able to stand under it and not get wet. And that what helps you do that is the tar weld. So that black line, it's not an aesthetic line. It's an intentional weld that's trying to keep the elements out. It's doing work while making the mark. So when my guy Hamza Walker, when me and Hamza would talk about great painters, now when Hamza would start talking about mark making, he would just talk about mark making, moving paint around, doing things. And then when I would look at Richter's, those moves where it was like, all right, I've done this, now I can just take my squeegee and I can just have fun, you know what I mean? It made me think of these moments when I was young and I was trying to learn how to roof. And this was when you would use a tar bucket, hot tar, and a mop. And you would mop first, and then you would roll felt, and then you would mop over the felt. So it was very important that you were efficient in your strokes, because if it got too messy, it would mean that you were stepping on tar, then you were moving your tarred foot into felt and messing up the roof. So there was some efficiency. I was messy when I started, Pollock style. And my dad would say, you can't roof like that. And then he took the mop. I remember this so clearly, man. He took that mop and he turned the handle so that it could grab up the tar. And then he just started at one end, and then he just like, there was something about his mood, man. It was like, wow, wow. You know what I mean? And it was like all of a sudden, I understood why my dad's obliques was so thin and mine was a little bit thicker. You know what I'm saying? And he had this move, and he looked like a swordsman, or he looked like a dancer. You know what I mean? And he was just a good roofer, right? But this brother he had so much skill. And he would say, the more you fuss with it, the heavier it gets. You got to learn to use your body, and he would get low, man. It was so beautiful. You know what I mean? And so that 40 years of roofing helped me gain efficiency in technology. Like, he was better after the 40th year than he was when he started. So I gained, and it's like, those are the moments where if it's only a commodity, then these stories they're not necessary, they're not interesting. But when you can remove that part of it, and you can kind of think about how intelligent transmission happens through a mop, through a torch. This isn't fetishizing labor. This is education.
It's being human.
Education. It's continuing like that. My dad's DNA is in those welds. You know what I mean?
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Theaster. Now, one thing which we didn't talk about is, of course, another artwork you added to the pavilion, which is the amazing bell. And we began this talk with you activating the bell. And the bell is from the now demolished St. Lawrence Church, Chicago South Side. It's a bell you've used before in different contexts. And in a way, it has a lot to do with something we haven't spoken about yet, which I think is important also in both of your practice, which is the idea of the ritual. No? And Tarkovsky, the filmmaker, always said, we live in a world kind of bereft of rituals and need to kind of reintroduce rituals. Saint-Exupéry was one of the pieces of paper we lost. Yeah, he said rituals are in life what things are in space. That was Saint-Exupéry. Also interesting, I think, in relation to the pavilion. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about the bell, maybe the history of the bell, because it's also connected to memory, to archive, and how it then connects to ritual.
Yeah, so since you mentioned Tarkovsky, this film, which some of you might know, Andrei Rublev, it's the great Tarkovsky's film. Toward the end of this movie, is my interpretation. There's this moment where this church, which after some time, revolution broke out. There was no longer a need for the church. There's this church that wants to reconstitute itself, but it doesn't have a bell. So because it doesn't have a bell, there's no way to call the people back to this place, right? The bell was the kind of object of calling. It's the signaler that it's okay to come back to this place, that in some ways maybe there was a recharge, a reboot of this thing that wasn't working. But nobody knows how to make a bell anymore. So this boy says, I know how to make the bell, but the boy doesn't know how to make the bell. So we could say that the boy kind of has faith, or he was like a low-key hustler. So he's like, it's like when you fill out a grant application, but you don't actually know how to do the thing you fill out the grant for. So the boy is like, they're like, okay, great, you'll make the bell. And then the boy goes and tries to find the expert, which is what artists do when they hire fabricators. And so the boy is searching for the great bell maker who's now like a drunkard, right? He's like, I don't want to make no bells. I'm done with that. I ain't making no bells, right? Anyway, the boy casts the bell. They're casting the bell. They find the right kind of clay. They embed it in the ground, the heat, the furnaces, and it looks like a Matthew Barney. Matthew Barney took some cues from this. It's pouring into the bell, and then the bell cools, and then they're afraid that now we've made the bell, but will it sound? So will I have empty form without still the possibility of the call? Right? Oh, this is my interpretation. I would never be hired by Mubi because I would be too exhaustive in my explanations. Anyway, in that sense, the bell is the call, and it's like, and so it could be any number of things. The return to oneself, the return to the possibility of ritual, but it also has something to do with objecthood. And when this church in Chicago, St. Lawrence, when it was torn down, if the scrappers would have taken this bronze brass mixed bell, if you would scrap the bell, you would probably get $25, $50. The bell's probably 2 tons, right? And so then it's like, man, well, what's the value of a bronze bell? And it's like, it's either worth $50 or it could be the thing that calls one back toward a sacred self, right? And so I've just been carrying this bell around until I find a permanent home for it. I might have to charge you a little more than $50 for the bell, but if you want it in your home, let me know.
Now, I know that we are out of time and we want to take some of your questions. I have 1 or 2 last questions for you. I thought before, when we talked about the techniques and you described in such a beautiful way the DNA and roofing, it kind of made me actually think about, David, you going into sculpture, because the ancient techniques, of block, of round earth, which is in your sculpture, Adjaye, and I think it's interesting at the moment, when Theaster does a pavilion here in Kensington, you as an architect make sculpture. Can you tell us about these new Adjaye series, which in a way have to do with the connection to very ancient techniques, to memory, to African architecture, but are also deeply connected to what Theaster was telling us a lot today about the idea of social space as a community building tool?
Hans is so good at what he does. It's taken me this long to, after 30 years of making buildings, that I'm now brave enough to make objects. I'm obsessed with that idea of the transmission of information through processes, through labor. I actually think that labor is deeply sacred. I'm trying to find a sort of vibration in that can give me a different way of looking at the things that I've been looking at for a very long time. So for me, sculpture, you call it sculpture. I'm still at that bit where I don't call it sculpture yet. But I'm definitely moving into this thing which is becoming very exciting for me. It is not, it's at the beginning, but yes. It's the other way around.
It's courageous, David. Well done, man. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I wanted to say one last thing, which is when I came back from our first trip to see you, Theaster, we went to see Etel Adnan, the amazing Lebanese poet, and we told her about the visit with you and what you do. And she said something which I thought we could maybe conclude with, because I think it's an homage to your pavilion. Etel said that it's about togetherness, not separation, about love, not suspicion, about a common future and not isolation. Theaster and David, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And now we can open it up for your comments and questions. And another big round of applause for Theaster and David. And I think we have about 10, 15 minutes, so if there are questions, yeah, we've got a question here.
Yeah, hi. My name's Nate. I'm a cultural producer, stepping a bit more into art stuff. And I feel like, as you've mentioned, Hans, like architecture is a social act. A lot of the works you guys have created, whether it's been institutions, museums, cathedrals now, socio-cultural spaces like in Chant Street and Shoreditch, or turning banks into complete institutions and libraries. A lot of the works you guys have created has had a lot of social impact, and it's been seen and felt by a lot of lives. As you get closer to your practice becoming more art-focused as opposed to urban planning-focused, or to metrics and mechanics of architecture, how do you see there being a connection between actually transforming and building that city that you were talking about? And what ways are there that you think we could go about like bridging that gap between culture and our built environment? Big question, sorry.
Yeah, no, maybe I can, I'll try a few things. I'm always thinking about Kendrick Lamar and kind of what happens when the things you used to rap about are no longer a truth. Like, can you get from that, you know, like say the PhD who is able to write the first book because they've had 7 years to think about that book, plus the rest of their lives. What happens to book 2? What happens to album 2 and 3, right? And what happens when your emotional or social center seems to change, or the artistic practice changes? And I think, producer to producer, I think that there's a way in which one has to keep asking oneself, who am I? What's my adjacency to the people who I love? Who are my people? What do I have that I can share? So that I couldn't have imagined that I would be giving advice on diversity to the Prada Corporation, right? But as a result of that kind of move, which has nothing to do with my artistic practice in a way, it's just like, I love Mucha, that would then make room for me to be able to give money away, for David to be able to give money away to support emerging designers and artists of color, right? So where it started with the bank and it was like all my cash, whatever, then it was like influence and being able to leverage influence to do things, plus me not needing certain resources meant that there were more resources to give, or people could trust me more because they knew I was good, or like I wouldn't eat all the chicken before everybody came because I'm already full, you know what I'm saying? Like, and so I think that there's a way to kind of ask yourself over time, how do I continue to be, if your values are solid, the output of those values will be consistent and aligned. You may just be able to scale your values. You may be able to do more, right? The thing that I'm often asking myself is, as things get better or worse, have my values changed? And then, am I giving as much as I can? Am I giving with the same tenacity that I did when I started? Am I giving with more tenacity? Am I sharing more, right? And it's also funny because like at the time where I probably like people less today, I feel more generous toward people than I ever have. And where I used to love people a lot, just a lot of energy, I felt like I was also in some ways guarded or worried, like I could love to a point. But now I'm just kind of like I feel like with love, if bad things are gonna happen, they're going, if I know that I'm living the life I'm supposed to live. So I think that it has something to do with solidifying some set of core values around, then the rap will continue. It's like you could rap about anything, and it'll go from like a rap about impoverishment financially to a rap about spiritual impoverishment and the desire to pursue something else. That new Kendrick is fire.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for this wonderful conversation. And my question is actually to all of you. What are these fundamental expressions for each of you? Thank you.
I think all the values that we've been discussing, I think here, are really what are really at the heart of this. So in a way, I would say that if you look at all the practices that are on this chair, on this platform, these are the fundamental human qualities that we're talking about: a kind of generosity, a sort of love for each other, an ability to sort of share knowledge, to flatten knowledge. I would say these are some of the things.
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate, what Etel told us when I told her about visiting Theaster, love, not suspicion, common future, not isolation, togetherness, not separation. And also, there is a panel you could maybe watch where there's a lot of answers about this, which was actually when we had the pavilion here of Francis Queré, who did a space of gathering also, kind of around a tree. And it was interesting because we then did a panel actually in Miami where Francis designed a display for a conversation. And we were there with Virgil Abloh, whom I want to remember here, and had a big discussion in this basically display Queré designed about the future of the city. And exactly, about your question, and I did what I always do. I recorded on the phone because I never, I think always the official recording might fail. So then we must have a recording. And Virgil, who sat next to me, did the same. So our two phones met, as our two phones meet here. And what I didn't know is that after the talk, Virgil, literally the moment the talk ended, texted, or WhatsApped the file to London, because he had a seminar at the time at the AA, and suggested actually that the students at the AA, his group, would by next week build a 3D model of all the ideas discussed, would build the city, basically. So anyway, you can listen to that online.
There's a scene in The Matrix called The Leapers, where Zion is under attack, and the attack's going to happen the following day, and they're trying to decide what to do, and they decide to party. And this leaper scene is like, I think my city needs an ongoing party as its primary value.
Quick comment about what you guys do for so many people dealing with the anxiety of achievement. And I'm particularly interested in disenfranchised communities, and a lot of young folks have anxiety around achievement. And so looking at these two successful practices, particularly architectural and artistic practice, I really like what you guys spoke about, this invisible scaffolding to your success, and the need to be honest about what you want to do. And if there's something that I take from this, that you talk about this being a social experiment and a social experience, what you guys have done, what you guys can do to inspire young kids about being honest about what you want to do. Just pursue your path and take your time, and success will come. I know Theaster personally, so many people are inspired by that. So that invisible scaffolding that you guys put in place is something that I hope a lot of kids here take to heart. So I just want to make that quick comment to you guys.
Yeah, but Ruben, it's interesting because we talked about this over there. I think I was just taught to work hard. There was no like one day I might be this or it was just like work hard, and like hard work might yield something. So it's like when I was at the Transit Authority, I didn't think like I want to be the world-class planner. And I remember when I was at Harvard, that dude, a gentleman said, well, there are lots of star architects. I don't know any star planners. And he was dissing the planning department. I was like, oh, you're going to have to pay for that one, man. I'm going to be the coldest, you know what I mean? And it's just like, I just wanted to work hard. And then and through working hard, it meant that then, like I said, 20 Cups would morph into something else. And like planning morphed. It was like, no, I don't want to work for the city. I don't want to work for one religious organization and help them do affordable housing. That's what I thought I'd end up doing. It was like urban planning more. Like what planning meant to me changed as I stayed in the profession or in the vocation longer, as I accrued understanding and experience. And so I think working hard at least established meaning in my life. The other stuff is excess, you know what I mean? But the meaning, it's like, oh, when a British critic says some crazy shit, it don't mean nothing because the purpose by which you're making has nothing to do with that dude. You know what I mean? I would encourage people to work hard. And because, that sounds a little old-fashioned, but it seems like I really think that it's really great to learn skills and have knowledge and apply that stuff and reapply it.
Now I've got it. I wanted to start just with what David said about cities being 10,000 years old and your cups taking 40 years to reach. And then I looked up and I wanted to ask you directly, you must have thought of the Pantheon in Rome with this, and the sense of that building there, which was once a Greek temple and then became a Christian church and now is a tourist site. So that what you're doing is this palimpsest built in layers and layers from old cities, old ideas, old spiritualities to create something of this moment now. I mean, did you think of the Pantheon in Rome?
Oh, I'll do one better. I remember one time David and I were getting off the phone and he was like, Theaster, you don't own the circle. I don't own the circle. The circle's a circle. You know what I mean?
But the way that it frames the clouds, that's exactly,
let's unpack this a little bit. It was actually, before I went to the Pantheon, it was St. Pietro's Tempietto, like the beautiful minor pavilion, right? This beautiful little space. It was like, oh, with those colonnades around it. I found myself deeply attracted to the mausoleum and the place of burial, the altar that lives in the city as a kind of reminder of the truth of the city's past and of great people, which is why, I have strong opinions about statues being completely obliterated. That it's like, if you completely obliterate them, you forget that cities were racist. Can you add to the monument to help remind people that some bad shit went down, but we're a better people now? And how do you do that? It may mean the removal of a statue is a better move. It might do something, but when you do that, you start erasing the city, erasing the truths of complicated cities, which is like, you can erase the fact that Great Britain was involved in the slave trade, but it doesn't take away anybody's wealth. The wealth is still an indicator of the fact that there was subjugation happening. Right? Removing the statue. So, when I saw the Pantheon, I was in awe.
But the history of the circle, the circle that the Pantheon takes goes back to the beginnings of human civilization. The obsession with it now is because it really goes back to a primal state, even before Rome. And I've done a slideshow for people, from villages to it is in the DNA of our psyche. When we make enclosure or when we're in enclosure, to see the heavens, and the circle becomes a kind of the circle is a kind of, it's the infinite, right?
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. And it seemed a good moment for me to ask a question because I'm coming from the sort of architecture point of view. And I must say, I think I perhaps enjoyed most was when you were talking about value engineering, which I don't want to sound like really nerdy and techie about it, but I think it's really great to hear a discussion about art and architecture and life and cities and all of the kind of massive, complex and inspiring things that you've talked about, but to also tackle the things that often are deemed as sort of too ordinary or boring or technical to be discussed as part of a discussion about art and architecture with a capital A, you know. And I think that's just really, really important, you know, that those things are considered as a, you know, important part of the process. And it seems to me that's a big problem with, you know, buildings around us, is that that's separated from the kind of artistic discussion, isn't it? Because it is the art, really, isn't it? So that was great. But I wondered if you could say a bit maybe about the building that we're in, the chapel, and could you just, because we haven't really talked much about it, its materiality, or its, you said, you know, you used this term, the algorithmic what was, I can't remember what it was, but you know, you were having a dig at architectural critics, but you know, I am interested to know a bit more about the materials and how it comes together. And I mean, especially the outside with this kind of rubber, it looks like a rubber kind of covering, which I guess is a modern version of the tar material that your dad would have worked with, modern day roofing material. Could you say a bit about that as a material, and also the blackness of it, which is not really black, is it? I mean, it's all kinds of colors, which is beautiful. But I was interested in blackness as a, you know, as a color, not as a racial condition, but as an aesthetic thing, really, and what that represents, and how important it was to be really black, or to reflect the you know, the color in the park and the surroundings.
David, you mentioned earlier that great architecture is about choice rather than performance, and I wondered if you could expand on that, please. Thanks.
Thank you, David. It's very short. I wonder what was the high point of this collaboration for both of you, and why? Thank you.
Satisfied? Shall I take choice? You can take color, blackness. You can take the other. You can tell us the high point. No. So what I mean by choice is that, you know, I think that there's always a kind of confusion that actually it's the program. It's the idea of what is required that's actually making the architecture. I think that, you know, maybe you can imagine in a situation before the city was made, that was kind of profound, that somebody kind of did that. And I think that would have been made as a kind of story. It wouldn't have been made as a program. But once you've understood the idea of construction, architecture is then moved into kind of representing or inventing things that don't exist, right? That's the history of architecture, inventing and creating things that don't exist. The public square, the facade, the dome. These things are about, and those things are not in the brief, right? They're the kind of moment that goes past that. And I think that, for me, that the same thing is still performing in the 21st century, where we've made lots of buildings. So it's not about just, okay, we need to make a building, so that's what makes the building great, because we're making the building, or because we choose that that's what we want to. But it's the intention and what the thing that you've used as the building does for the evolution of the art form. And that is getting thinner and thinner and thinner as we make more and more and more, right? So that's what I mean by the choice is really important. What is it that you think you're doing? Thank you.
Yep, so several things were kind of led to the organization of this space. I have a series of projects that have the word Black that precedes the things. Black Archive, Black Madonna Press, Black Imaging, this kind of Black Vessel for a Saint, so on and so on. And that in those works, I was kind of playing with the word Black, both sides of it, really, but also trying to describe a kind of emotional condition more than I'm trying to describe like a racialized condition. Like Nina Simone has this song, "Black is the color of my true love's hair." And there's something about the way she sings it that is not, she's talking about love, but with such deep sadness in her voice. And it's Black as an emotional condition, right? But I also felt like the building itself was citing the silo, like kind of a basic granary, like in the US we call it a silo, like storage, right? And that there's something about that. You have a grain elevator that takes things up and posits them, and so there's that hole again, kind of working in this conveyor belt that moves materials. I like that. I like that Peter Zumthor's pavilion was Black. I like when I find old plywood, like old 1920s plywood, and the grain of the plywood is almost protruding out from the rest of the reinforced poly-ply laminate. When that brown pops out, I feel like there's something in this stain that makes the grain pop, and that was enough of an aesthetic move that we didn't need then gypsum board, or that the building was saying enough with its most primary elements, and that any other skin would have cost more. But then it's like the building didn't need to be bombastic or painted pink, or there was nothing that I was trying to say in the color, except I want a building that disappears, as it could get out of the way, right? And I thought one way of demonstrating my deep respect for architecture and art was by trying to make a pavilion that would move out of the way of people, and that it would just, in its bones, people could rest, like in its bones, right? And these were also decisions that we were having to solve lots of problems at the same time. Where's the lighting gonna go? Where will people sit? Should we have chairs and stools? And it was like, man, all those things would interrupt the circle. And if all of a sudden, it may end up getting filled with chairs and that, but when it's empty, it offers this other possibility of the sacred. So can we build seating into the bones so that at least people could be at the perimeter of the things? There was that. Then also, David has made Black buildings, right? So I knew there were moments where we would have a kind of shared intention. Black Vessel was also about the fact that at Gagosian, many of the vessels that I made were made from a manganese dioxide, which was both matte and sheen, so that these walls have shimmer like manganese dioxide. They have a matteness, but they're also super reflective. So there's, it's, in a way, it's not that I'm without the capacity to talk about architecture. I deeply love the profession. What I found, though, was I could take advantage of my license to be an artist and kind of bring to the Pavilion Commission, which I called earlier, like it's its own act of faith that an institution would, endorse a non-architect. Feels like a demonstration of Hans' belief in art, which feels religious to me. Hans's belief in art feels religious, like it's in his bones. If you ever get to know this guy, so I think that in that sense, the building is trying to offer the truth that plywood and 2x4s and glue lamps and reinforced posts, that those truths in their minority status on the construction site, as the things that are always covered up or insulated, or that those minority materials also have beauty that every material has the capacity for innate beauty if we labor with the material enough. And I think the building is trying to demonstrate that.
Yes, and David, thank you so much. I wanted to say that we really hope that you come back many, many times this summer, because as initially said, Theaster is very involved in the programming. We're going to have many different programs culminating in October with performances by Corinne Bailey Ray and the Black Monks. And we're going to have the Friday Park Nights with Roscoe Mitchell, with readings, poetry readings by Linton Kwesi Johnson, with a performance by artist Josiane Posey. So it has only just begun. Thank you so much, Theaster. Thank you so much, David. And thank you all.